The Lord be with you. Welcome to our Lenten lectures in the year of our Lord 2025 at Providence Church. And as a way to begin our time together on this Saturday morning, let's begin by singing Psalm 23. Psalm 23 in your insert. Please rise together. Amen. Let us pray together. Our Father and our God, we thank you that we stand before you as your sheep. For you are the great shepherd of Israel, the great shepherd of the world. You make us to lie down in places of pleasure, replenish and refreshing to our hearts and souls. And when we are weak and frail, yet when we were yet sinners, you, O Christ, died for us, laying your life as the great shepherd for your sheep. We thank you, O Lord, for the time we have this morning. May you grant us pleasures evermore. And we ask for blessings upon your servant, Dr. Joe Rigney, that we might learn and increase in wisdom and knowledge, and so drawing nearer and nearer to our shepherd, Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. Please be seated. We at Providence have been deeply enriched by our lecturers in this past church year, and I believe firmly that our speaker this morning is going to add to our growing repertoire. Our speaker for our Lenten lectures in this 2025 is Dr. Joe Rigney. After many years serving as professor and president of Bethlehem College and Seminary, Joe accepted an offer as a fellow of theology at New St. Andrews College in Moscow, Idaho, where he also serves as a minister at Christ Church. He's an author of many books, some of which you'll find in the back if there are any available for your purchase. And as you peruse through the selection of Dr. Rigney's books, you'll see a very distinct flavor to each of them. Dr. Rigney's writings are a combination of Christian hedonism meets the academy. It's glorify God and enjoy Him forever meets the queen of the sciences. You can see this very clear in his labors on C.S. Lewis, Jonathan Edwards, and in his political philosophy. There's a very clear attempt to make the sovereignty of God not a thing to grasp, but a thing to love and adore. Joe is what I call a happy generalist, someone who takes a deep interest in the things of God and who pursues them vigorously, whether it be baseball or Shakespeare plays. I have known Dr. Rigney for over a decade, but had the opportunity to first meet him in Miami at the National Conservative Conference in 2022. Joe did a fascinating job as he lectured on the concept of the Tao in C.S. Lewis, where he argued for a universal moral order applied to all things, rigorously to the social issues of our day. And he drew wild applause from a very, very diverse conservative audience. I was having a conversation with a mutual friend of ours, Dr. Yoram Hazony, who is a delightful Orthodox Jewish man. Afterwards, he asked me, Yuri, is that guy one of y'all? And I said, yes, he is. And in our day, it's a delight to have Joe on our side. So this morning, it's a real pleasure to welcome Dr. Joe Rigney to speak at our 2025 Lenten Lectures. Thank you, Joe.
All right, well, it is a joy to be with you, and I'm looking forward to talking with you today about Puddleglum. So let me pray one more time, and then we'll begin. Father, I ask for your help now. Make me your vessel and your instrument. Help me to be helpful to these that listen, and we pray it all in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, it might be an exaggeration to say that the most profound analysis of and response to modernity was included in a children's fairy tale featuring talking owls, friendly giants, and depressed gnomes. But if it's an exaggeration, it's only a slight one. What Lewis accomplishes in 12 short pages, it's about 2,700 words, is remarkable. Because he not only expresses modernity's most potent objection against the Christian faith, but he also portrays the social, imaginative, and environmental factors that give that objection its power. More than that, he provocatively frames modernity as modernity. When I say modernity, don't think modernism as in like it's an ideology. Think of it as the conditions of life that we call modern, conditions of life that have obtained in particularly the West, now the whole world, over the last 150 to 200 years. Okay, that's what we mean by modernity. He frames modernity as a kind of dark enchantment, vividly depicting the psychological pull of unbelief and atheism. And most importantly, in the actions and speech of Puddleglum the Marshwiggle, he shows how to break the spell and fight the fight of faith in the modern world. So what I'm planning to do over the next two lectures is to try to unpack how Lewis diagnosed what he thought of as modernity. How does this little episode in The Silver Chair depict the social conditions of modernity, and how does it explain what one author calls the way in which, for modern people, even those who are Christians, that there is still a kind of default pull of unbelief that's somewhat unique relative to the history of the world. It's not the case. Unbelief's always been a problem, but the kind of unbelief that we deal with in the modern world is of a different order. And so why does it feel like, even for Christians, atheism is the sort of thing that you sort of have to deal with, and maybe have to deal with over and over again? Like, why is that? That's what we're going to talk about. So the first lecture is on the Dark Enchantment, and the second lecture will be on Puddleglum's response. So in order to help you out, we're going to begin by reading those 2,700 words. Maybe not that, it's not quite that much. But reading the section from The Silver Chair in which this episode appears. And so if you don't have the story fresh in your mind, Aslan calls Eustace Scrubb and Jill Pole into Narnia in order to send them on a quest to find the lost Prince Rilian, the son of Caspian. And Rilian's been gone for 10 years. We don't know what happened to him, and they've got to go find him. They're given signs by which Aslan will guide them through their journey. They team up with Puddleglum, the marsh wiggle, to go on this journey. They muff the signs repeatedly. They totally blow it over and over again, and yet still somehow wind up in the right place. They find the prince and liberate him from his captivity. He'd been bewitched for these 10 years and had been tied to a silver chair every night in order to sort of do the enchantment. They liberate him. He destroys the chair, and they're about to head out when we have this scene, chapter 12 of Silverchair. Here we go. Two Earthmen, these are the gnomes who run stuff in Underland, with the queen. There's a queen. Entered, but instead of advancing into the room, they placed themselves one on each side of the door and bowed deeply. They were followed immediately by the last person whom anyone had expected or wished to see, the Lady of the Green Kirtle, the Queen of Underland. That's actually going to be important too. So if you're not familiar with the story, they're underground. So rather than being in Narnia up on top, they're now deep underground in Underland. She stood dead still in the doorway, and they could see her eyes moving as she took in the whole situation. The three strangers, the silver chair destroyed, the prince free, his sword in his hand. She turned very white, but Jill thought it was the sort of whiteness that comes over some people's faces, not when they are frightened, but when they are angry. And for a moment, the witch fixed her eyes on the prince, and there was murder in them. Then she seemed to change her mind. "Leave us," she said to the two Earthmen, "and let none disturb us till I call on pain of death." The gnomes pattered away obediently, and the witch queen shut and locked the door. "How now, my lord prince," she said, "has your knightly fit not yet come upon you, or is it over so soon? Why stand you here unbound? Who are these aliens, and it is they who have destroyed the chair which was your only safety?" Prince Rilian shivered as she spoke to him, and no wonder. It is not easy to throw off in a half an hour an enchantment which has made one a slave for 10 years. Then, speaking with a great effort, he said, "Madam, there will be no more need of that chair, and you who have told me 100 times how deeply you pitied me for the sorceries by which I was bound will doubtless hear with joy that they are now ended forever. There was, it seems, some small error in your ladyship's way of treating them. These, my true friends, have delivered me. I am now in my right mind, and there are two things I will say to you. First, as for your ladyship's design of putting me at the head of an army of Earthmen, so that I may break out into the overworld and there, by main force, make myself king over some nation that never did me wrong, murdering their natural lords and holding their throne as a bloody and foreign tyrant. Now that I know myself, I do utterly abhor and renounce it as plain villainy. And second, I am the king's son of Narnia, Rilian, the only child of Caspian, 10th of that name, whom some call Caspian the seafarer. Therefore, madam, it is my purpose, as it is also my duty, to depart suddenly from your highness's court into my own country. Please it you to grant me and my friends safe conduct and a guide through your dark realm." Now the witch said nothing at all, but moved gently across the room, always keeping her face and eyes very steadily toward the prince. When she had come to a little ark set in the wall, not far from the fireplace, she opened it and took out first a handful of a green powder. This she threw on the fire. It did not blaze much, but a very sweet and drowsy smell came from it. And all through the conversation which followed, that smell grew stronger and filled the room, and made it harder to think. Secondly, she took out a musical instrument rather like a mandolin. She began to play it with her fingers, a steady, monotonous thrumming that you didn't notice after a few minutes. But the less you noticed it, the more it got into your brain and your blood. This also made it harder to think. And after she had thrummed for a time, and the sweet smell was now strong, she began speaking in a sweet, quiet voice. "Narnia," she said, "Narnia. I've often heard your lordship utter that name in your ravings. Dear prince, you are very sick. There is no land called Narnia." "Oh, yes there is, oh ma'am," said Puddleglum. "You see, I happen to have lived there all my life." "Indeed," said the witch. "Tell me, I pray you, where that country is." Up there," said Puddleglum stoutly, pointing overhead. I don't know exactly where." "How?" said the queen with a kind, soft, musical laugh. "Is there a country up among the stones and mortar on the roof?" "No," said Puddleglum, struggling a little to get his breath. It's an overworld." "And what or where, pray, is this? How do you call it? Overworld?" "Oh, don't be silly," said Scrubb, who was fighting hard against the enchantment of the sweet smell and the thrumming. "As if you didn't know. It's up above, up where you can see the sky and the sun and the stars. Why, you've been there yourself. We met you there." I cry you mercy, little brother, laughed the witch. You couldn't have heard a lovelier laugh. I have no memory of that meeting, but we often meet our friends in strange places when we dream, and unless all dreamed alike, you must not ask them to remember it. Madam, said the prince sternly, I have already told your grace that I am the king's son of Narnia. And shalt be, dear friend, said the witch in a soothing voice, as if she was humoring a child, shalt be king of many imagined lands in thy fancies. We've been there too, snapped Jill. She was very angry because she could feel enchantment getting hold of her every moment. But of course, the very fact that she could still feel it showed that it had not yet fully worked. And thou art queen of Narnia too, I doubt not, pretty one, said the witch in the same coaxing, half-mocking tone. I'm nothing of the sort, said Jill, stamping her foot. We come from another world. Why, this is a prettier game than the other, said the witch. Tell us, little maid, where is this other world? What ships and chariots go between it and ours? Of course, a lot of things darted into Jill's head at once. Experiment house, Adela Pennyfather, her own home, radio sets, cinemas, cars, airplanes, ration books, and queues. But they seemed dim and far away. Thrum, thrum, thrum went the strings of the witch's instrument. Jill couldn't remember the names of the things in our world, and this time it didn't come into her head that she was being enchanted. For now the magic was in its full strength. And of course, the more enchanted you get, the more you feel that you are not enchanted at all. She found herself saying, and at the moment it was a relief to say, No, I suppose that other world must be all a dream. Yes, it is all a dream, said the witch, always thrumming. Yes, all a dream, said Jill. There never was such a world, said the witch. No, said Jill and Scrub, never was such a world. There never was any world but mine, said the witch. There never was any world but yours, said they. Puddleglum was still fighting hard. I don't know rightly what you all mean by a world, he said, talking like a man who hasn't enough air. But you can play that fiddle your fingers drop off, and still you won't make me forget Narnia, and the whole overworld too. We'll never see it again, I shouldn't wonder. You may have blotted it out and turned it dark like this, for all I know. Nothing more likely. But I know I was there once. I've seen the sky full of stars, and I've seen the sun coming up out of the sea of a morning and sinking behind the mountains at night, and I've seen him up in the midday sky when I couldn't look at him for brightness. Puddleglum's words had a very rousing effect. The other three all breathed again and looked at one another like people newly waked. Why, there it is, cried the prince. Of course, the blessing of Aslan upon this honest marshwiggle. We've all been dreaming these last few minutes. How could we have forgotten it? Of course, we've all seen the sun. By Jove, so we have, said Scrub. Good for you, Puddleglum. You're the only one of us with any sense, I do believe. Then came the witch's voice, cooing softly like the voice of a wood pigeon from the high elms in an old garden at 3 o'clock in the middle of a sleepy summer afternoon. And it said, What is this sun that you all speak of? Do you mean anything by the word? Yes, we jolly well do, said Scrub. Can you tell me what it's like? Asked the witch. Thrum, thrum, thrum went the strings. Please it, your grace, said the prince very coldly and politely. You see that lamp? It is round and yellow and gives light to the whole room, and hangeth moreover from the roof. Now that thing which we call the sun is like the lamp, only far greater and brighter. It giveth light to the whole overworld, and hangeth in the sky. Hangeth from what, my lord? Asked the witch. And then, while they were all still thinking how to answer her, she added, with another of her soft silver laughs, You see, when you try to think out clearly what this sun must be, you cannot tell me. You can only tell me it's like the lamp. Your sun is a dream, and there's nothing in that dream that was not copied from the lamp. The lamp is the real thing. The sun is but a tale, a children's story. Oh, yes, I see now, said Jill in a heavy, hopeless tone. It must be so. And while she said this, it seemed to her to be very good sense. Slowly and gravely the witch repeated, There is no sun. And they all said nothing. And she repeated in a softer and deeper voice, There is no sun. After a pause and after a struggle in their minds, all four of them said together, You are right, there is no sun. It was such a relief to give in and say it. There never was a sun, said the witch. No, there never was a sun, said the prince and the marshwiggle and the children. Now, for the last few minutes, Jill had been feeling that there was something she must remember at all costs, and now she did. But it was dreadfully hard to say it. She felt as if huge weights were laid on her lips, and at last, with an effort that seemed to take all the good out of her, she said, There's Aslan. Aslan, said the witch, quickening ever so slightly the pace of her thrumming. What a pretty name. What does it mean? He's the great lion who called us out of our own world, said Scrub, and sent us in this to find Prince Rilian. What is a lion? Asked the witch. "Oh, hang it all," said Scrub. "Don't you know? How can we describe it to her? Have you ever seen a cat?" "Oh, surely," said the Queen. "I love cats." "Well, a lion is a little bit, but only a little bit, mind you, like a huge cat with a mane. Well, it's not like a horse's mane, you know. It's more like a judge's wig, and it's yellow and terrifically strong." The witch shook her head. "I see," she said, "that we should do no better with your lion, as you call it, than we did with your sun. You have seen lamps, and so you imagined a bigger and better lamp and called it the sun. You've seen cats, and now you want a bigger and better cat, and it's to be called a lion. Well, 'tis a pretty make-believe, though to say truth, it would suit you all better if you were younger. And look how you can put nothing into your make-believe without copying it from the real world, this world of mine, which is the only world. But even you children are too old for such play. As for you, my lord prince, that art a man full grown, fie upon you! Are you not ashamed of such toys? Come, all of you, put away these childish tricks. I have work for you all in the real world. There is no Narnia, no overworld, no sky, no sun, no Aslan. And now to bed all, and let us begin a wiser life tomorrow. But first to bed, to sleep, deep sleep, soft pillows, sleep without foolish dreams." Now, we'll come back to Puddleglum's defiance in a moment, but let's get clear on the nature of the enchantment. And we'll explore it under 4 headings: the argument, the rhetoric, the mythological background, and the environment, or the atmosphere. So let's begin with the argument. The witch's major claim is pretty simple. Narnia and Overworld is a fiction. It's a fantasy, a fairy tale. It's not real. The question, then, is one of realism. What is real? The real world here is set in opposition to the dream world, filled with sun, moon, stars, Narnia, and Aslan. Those are merely make-believe, satisfying some childish wish-fulfillment fantasy. So in her telling, the witch is a committed realist, insisting that the prince, the children, and the Marshwiggles set aside their juvenile fairy tale games and live and move and have their being in the real world, this world of mine, which is the only world. After all, there's work to do in this real world. Now, in response to the hero's insistence that Narnia and the sun and Aslan are real, the witch engages in a subtle game of debunking, of unmasking. And you can view her arguments from 2 angles. You can either view it in terms of projection or reduction, okay? And they go hand in hand. So on the one hand, she argues that the sun and lions are merely projections of lamps and cats. So if you start from the thing in quote-unquote the real world, in Underland, and you move up to the make-believe, that's projection. The sun is a projection of a lamp. A lion is a projection of a cat. Or you could come at it the other way, and if you started with the lion and the sun, it's a reduction. You reduce the lion and the sun to lamps and cats. And of course, this whole premise is built on a basic fact, the similarity between the sun and the lamp, and the similarity between the lion and the cat. And that's a comparison, a connection that the heroes themselves recognize. Yes, that's what they are like each other. In this way, her argument then is a form of reductive realism. In the modern world, we call this scientific reductionism. It's the view that all of reality can be reduced to its material causes, the causes that science is able to study. The world and all it contains is simply chemicals in motion, atoms banging about, molecules flying every which way, some of them singing, some of them fighting, some of them praying and eating. That's what flying molecules like to do. Now, some philosophers have labeled this reductionism nothing buttery, nothing buttery, since everything that we see and know is nothing but a mixture of matter and motion. Humans are nothing but sacks of protoplasm. Children being smaller and cuter sacks, more like baggies of protoplasm. Love is nothing but a chemical reaction in someone's brain designed to facilitate the survival of the species, procreation. Far from being man's best friend, a dog is nothing but the current product of random evolutionary processes that are leading us nobody knows where. We know that we're in the presence of nothing buttery when we begin using words like only and merely. Like, oh, that's only an evolved instinct. That's merely chemicals in the brain. That's nothing buttery. Now, the unseen but very real opponents that Lewis is engaging with are 19th and 20th century thinkers who sought to undermine Christianity, especially, through what's called the psychogenetic method. Okay, psychogenetic method. And it's associated with thinkers like Ludwig Feuerbach, Sigmund Freud, and still survives in various forms today. In fact, I think a lot of the new atheists of the last 20 years or so ago would have been very much in this frame. So these thinkers argued that human beings have created God in our own image, as a projection of our own yearnings, needs, and desires. So Feuerbach famously said that if man were a being of the birds, God would have wings. If man were a being of the birds, God would have wings. Why? Because if you have wings, then you're going to project big wings into the sky. In this sense, the Christian God, according to Feuerbach, is simply another man-made idol and should be toppled so that man can learn to believe in himself. And so the basic goal was to replace God with man, urging people to give up their childish ways and grow up into adulthood. Sound familiar? Now, since God is merely a projection of human ideals, that's the assumption, the psychogenetic method sought to identify what human needs were met by a belief in God, explain the origins in terms of those needs, and thereby undermine the belief's validity, cause its power to dissipate. So if you can explain belief in God in terms of primitive psychological and social needs, or today we might say, this is what Dawkins was trying to do with the God gene, right, in terms of genetics and sociological causes, then, the thought went, it might be possible to find some other way to meet that need and dispense with God altogether. We don't need him anymore. Now, the force of that argument, again, comes from two things. The similarity between the lower thing and the supposedly higher impulse in reality, and also a particular view of which one was original and which one was a copy. Okay? So Lewis actually wrote an essay in which he just summarized it. So listen, this is a longer quote, but listen to him talk about. Here he's talking about natural things versus supernatural and the way that they have this similarity. Put in its most general terms, our problem is that of the obvious continuity between things which are admittedly natural and things which, it is claimed, are spiritual. It's the reappearance in what professes to be our supernatural life of all the same old elements which make up our natural life. If we have really been visited by a revelation from beyond nature, is it not very strange that an apocalypse can furnish heaven with nothing more than selections from terrestrial experience, crowns, thrones, music? That devotion to God can find no language but that of human lovers? And that the rite whereby Christians enact a mystical union should turn out to be only the old familiar act of eating and drinking. And the same problem actually breaks out at the lower level, not only between the spiritual and the natural, but also between higher and lower levels of natural life. So cynics very plausibly challenge our civilized conception of the difference between love and lust. What's the difference between love and lust? By pointing out that when all is said and done, they usually end in what is physically the same act. There's no difference between love and lust. They similarly challenge the difference between justice and revenge on the ground that what finally happens to the criminal is the same. And in all these cases, let us admit that the cynics and the skeptics have a good prima facie case. The same acts do appear in justice as well as in revenge. The consummation of humanized and conjugal love is physiologically the same as that of merely biological lust. Religious language and imagery, and probably religious emotion too, contains nothing that has not been borrowed from nature. So that's the problem, is the similarity that we see, and so one of them can be reduced to the other. One of them is a projection of the other. Now, if you take that and then you say, okay, give another example. Freud famously argued that this is how belief in God came about. When you're a child, you're dependent upon your parents. And you come to see them, and especially your father, as a strong protector who provides you with food, shelter, safety, and security. But as you grow up, you discover your father is not as all-powerful as you thought, that he has failures and weaknesses too. But in realizing the weaknesses of our earthly fathers, we still have a psychological need for security and provision. We want to know that someone strong and loving is looking out for us. And so we project our fathers into the sky and invent our Father who's in heaven, giving ourselves the illusion of control and safety. So good things that happen to us are because God is loving and approving of us. Bad things are owing to his anger and judgment. And so Freud says that's where it came from. And so let's put this childish belief in God behind us. We know that it comes from these needs. And now through science and technology, we can grow up. We can stand on our own 2 feet. Now note the parallels there between Feuerbach, Freud, and the Green Lady. Right? For Freud, God the Father is simply a copy and projection of earthly fathers. Just as for the Green Lady, the sun is a fictional copy and projection of the lamp, and Aslan the lion is simply a bigger and better cat. That's the structure of the argument. Now, that argument is often buttressed, that realism, reductive realism, that nothing buttery, is often strengthened by a narrative of disenchantment. Disenchantment. So you hear a lot about this today. So the idea of the disenchantment narrative is this. In the old days, people used to experience the world as magical. They believed in supernatural beings, God, angels, fairies. The world was enchanted. But then along came science, and it debunked and explained away all of these magical realities. It's shown us that there are no such things as angels or fairies or God or heaven, and so now we experience the world as disenchanted. Now, Paul Tyson, an Australian philosopher, gives a little bit more detail to the story. He argues that science studies what he calls the 4M world, 4M world, meaning reality that is measurable, material, and mathematically modelable. Measurable, material, mathematically modelable. Science studies that. The non-4M world, he says, that's the world of magic. And so he's using magic to cover anything that we would call supernatural. Okay? And so he says, Tyson argues that we, in the modern world, reflexively experience the world as unmagical. Now, on the one hand, he says, we live in an age of technological magic. Electricity, iPhones, jet planes, so forth. And most of us have no idea how any of these things work. But that magic, that technological magic, is wedded to that realism, and that's the deep sort of substructure of our mind. Meanwhile, the realm of value and purpose and meaning is sort of relegated to, that's imagination, that's fantasy, that's projection. Those are the two divides in our mind. Well, how do we get there? Well, in the ancient world, there was two different theories of magic. Okay? There was the animist theory of magic, and what he calls the Platonist view, which the Christian view would fit under what he calls the Platonist view too. In the animist view, nature is shot through with magic. There's these forces and powers, but there's nothing beyond nature. It's kind of like a pantheism, if you think about it. Like the spiritual stuff works through all of the natural stuff. It's pantheism. The Platonist view says, yeah, there's magic in the world, but the magic transcends nature. There's something beyond nature, some spiritual reality. Nature itself participates in that, and so ancient Christians, medieval Christians, the ancient philosophers like Plato and Socrates and so forth would all fit in that category because God is present in the world but bigger than the world. Now, according to Tyson, in the 14th through 16th centuries, there was a new understanding of nature that emerged, and it was nature as a self-standing, autonomous reality. Yes, it was established by God. He sort of wound up the clock, but then he left it on the beach. And it runs now on its own. So this was a view of pure nature purged of transcendence. And so all explanations in this time period, 14th to 16th centuries, are natural explanations with two exceptions at this time period. The two exceptions were man, because man had a soul, and that was bigger than nature, and God will keep him around. And so this led to the kind of like that two-story view of the cosmos. Some of you may have picked that up, say, from Francis Schaeffer, right? This two-story view where all of nature kind of runs down here, and then the soul and God are upstairs. But as Tyson notes, it wasn't long before God and the soul were rendered superfluous, redundant. Why do we even need them anymore? And so by the mid-19th century, the time period in which Lewis is thinking, God was dismissed as unnecessary, and then man was placed under the microscope. And once under the microscope, all of those supernatural realities, meaning, purpose, value, morality, those are just subjective projections onto a meaningless cosmos. You can hear the echoes again. So he says, now science begins to debunk everything that's human. So human dignity and consciousness may appear to us to be magical, that is, non-material realities. But we know deep down that they are necessarily, in the final analysis, they're just cultural fantasies developed for biological reasons, or they're physical processes. They're the epiphenomena that float upon chemicals. And so qualities like beauty, goodness, and purpose have to be debunked. So he says, this is what we moderns are always doing. We modern people are required, think about that language of required, to reinterpret our direct magical experience of value and purpose. Like you experience, hey, there's meaning and purpose in the world, but now what do you have to do? You have to kind of reinterpret that experience in non-magical terms. Biological necessity, social conditioning, those are the real things. And all of the other things are subjective fictions. Listen to that. That's what we call them, subjective fictions produced by these real material causes. And so you can hear the overlap with the witch. And so he goes on to describe the way. Notice this is a final quote from Tyson. He says, we find that an anti-magical metaphysic of immanence is settling down, listen, like a heavy fog over the old landscape of the West's fading supernatural religious consciousness. The transcendent stars that used to guide us are now invisible. Again, you can hear the echo. Like it's the same kind of image. There's a fog settling in. We can't see the stars anymore. The semi-magical creatures of mystical powers are no longer in the imagination's eye, but they've become shadows in the fog, figments of our own making. In the half-light of this new climate, the flat unmeaning of all reality beyond our own making becomes increasingly culturally oppressive. Right? You just kind of like, you can just feel it. Just do this, go to sleep. Okay. So that's the argument. Okay? The argument is an argument of reductive realism and nothing buttery, buttressed by this disenchantment narrative. But the brilliance of Lewis's scene lies not only in the argument, but in his ability to show why does it feel so plausible. And so let's begin here with the witch's rhetorical approach. I wonder if you heard how she talked. After her initial flash of anger, she adopts this sweet, kind musical tone, right? She laughs easily and often. You couldn't have heard a lovelier laugh. And gives an appearance of softness and niceness in all of her questions. But more than that, she frequently adopts a coaxing, half-mocking tone, a soothing voice as if she was humoring a child. And this patronizing demeanor is crucial to the spell. This is important. She's treating the prince, the Marchwiggle, and the children as, well, children. She's patting them on the head for their vivid imaginations and make-believe, all while softly rebuking them, with a lovely laugh, for their childishness, and demanding it's time to grow up and put away childish things. Now, the real-world counterpart to that, what's the parallel in our situation, is the mockery and scorn heaped upon those who continue to believe in God and heaven and hell and the gospel by those who have grown out of it. So when Puddleglum insists that Narnia is real and up there, the witch responds with, is there a country on my roof? This is the same thing when Lewis writes an essay on this, when the Russians went into space for the first time, they sent somebody up. When he came back, they announced, God is not real. God does not exist. We went up and looked, we did not find him. So while often lacking the witch's playfulness, contemporary unbelievers regularly patronize and deride those who continue to cling to the crutch of Christ. Right? So think of the way that a term like sky daddy is deployed, not primarily as an argument, but as a rhetorical dismissal. I don't need to take you seriously because you believe in a sky daddy. Okay? Oh, you need your little sky daddy. Right? That sort of tone, right? And there's two different forms that this takes, corresponding roughly to what I call the new atheists and the nice atheists. Okay? New atheists were those like Dawkins, Hitchens, Dennett, Sam Harris, who were popular for a hot minute, no longer kind of fallen out of favor. But those new atheists were very scornful. They were overtly hostile. They knew who their enemy was, and they mocked it and dismissed it overtly. Okay, that's the new atheists. What I've called the nice atheists are those who substantively have the same beliefs as those guys, but now recognize that religion has some social utility, and so maybe we should keep it around. So we should be nice to these religious believers for a minute. So in this category, I put guys like Jonathan Haidt. If you've ever read anything by Jonathan Haidt, Righteous Mind, he's not a believer, but he's friendly, right, and wants to understand believers. I think Jordan Peterson kind of falls into that category as well. There's others that kind of, that space where there's a respect and regard for religion, but if push came to shove and you said, hey, between the two of us, right, we believe that he actually rose from the dead, you think it's a cool mythic story that helps us cope with the hardship of life, who's the more grown-up one? Who's the adult in the room? And for Peterson, it's going to be him, right? You still think it's real, just like your kids might still believe in Santa Claus. But he's just recognizing, yeah, Santa Claus actually is a fun thing, and it's a good little story, right? So it's that kind of mentality. It's that, again, that mocking. So the nice atheists patronize with indulgence and kindness in the way that the witch does. Now, why does this work? Why is this important? Well, that rhetoric appeals to the natural human desire to be taken seriously. Human beings, right, want to be seen as mature, as grown up. And you catch a glimpse of our own anger at being patronized when Jill stamps her foot when the witch mockingly says, "Art thou a queen of Narnia too?" Right? So, "Oh, you're a child of the king, that's cute." Right? That sort of tone, and how do we respond? No, right? We get angry at it. Okay? None of us like to be laughed at. We don't want to be mocked or treated with dismissal. And so if we can be conditioned into regarding Christianity as juvenile and silly, we are halfway to giving the whole thing up. But beyond the argument and the tone, Lewis insists there's something more that makes the arguments potent. The incense and the thrumming, the smells, the bells, the drowsy scents, and the mood music, there's something in the air that puts us under a spell. Now, I want to just really flag here, I think this is one of the more profound things that Lewis does. Notice that Lewis frames modernity not in terms of disenchantment, but as a dark enchantment. And I think this really matters. For Lewis, the standard narrative, that narrative that I read, we used to think the world was enchanted, but we lost it because science and technology told us what was truly real. Lewis says that's not what happened. That's not the story. Rather, we experience the world as unmagical because we have been put under a spell. Lewis speaks this way in The Weight of Glory. You remember that famous, it's the Mud Pies in the Slums sermon? And in that, he's basically talking about this inconsolable secret, this desire we have for something we know not what. And he talks about how they come to us through different means, through nature and through our memory and our childhood and all these things. And he says, they are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country that we've never yet visited. And it's kind of this like evocative language, right? And so then he follows it up with this. Listen. Do you think I'm trying to weave a spell? Perhaps I am. But remember your fairy tales. Spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as for inducing them. And you and I have need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness which has been laid upon us for nearly 100 years. Hear it? This is what Lewis is talking. What is this evil enchantment of worldliness? He goes on to note that our entire educational system, all of our modern philosophies are devoted to silencing our desire for another world and seeking to convince us that the good of man is to be found on earth. Or in the witch's terms, there is no world but mine. Now, to understand this, we have to get two things in play. The first is what Lewis calls the myth of universal evolutionism. So part of what makes this work is this background noise, right? The mood music, the soundtrack of modernity, the soundtrack of unbelief is the myth of evolution. What does he mean by that? It's the idea that small, feeble things perpetually turn themselves into large, strong, and ordered things. That's the basic germ of the idea. Small things become big, complex things. Simple things become complex, small becomes big. That's the idea. That the very formula of the universal system, how does the reality work, is from imperfect to perfect, from small beginnings to great endings, from rudimentary to elaborate. People find it natural to think that morality springs from savage taboos. Adult sentiments spring from infantile sexual maladjustments. There's Freud. Thought springs from instinct. Mind springs from matter. Organic springs from inorganic. Cosmos from chaos. Listen to what he says. This is perhaps the deepest habit of mind in the modern world. Like, that's the deepest habit of mind, that's the way everything works. In science, Lewis says, evolution, if you're talking to a biologist, is a theory about changes, but in the myth, it's a fact about improvements. Not just changes, but improvements. Lewis summarizes in one particular place, he summarizes the great myth, and I won't read this because we won't have time, but he basically presents the story of the cosmos, sort of the Carl Sagan kind of story of the cosmos, in a very epic fashion. So to summarize it, he's like, there's this infinite void and matter's endlessly moving about, and then by a millionth chance, all of a sudden, conditions at one space and time bubble up into this tiny little thing called organic life. First virus or bacteria pops up. Right? And at first, everything's against the infant hero, right? Everything's going to kill it. But life wins through, and with incalculable sufferings, think about all of the death, it spreads, it breeds, it complicates. Amoeba to reptile, up to the mammal. There's this climax, there's this age of monsters. The dragons prowl the earth. I said I wasn't going to do it, and here I am. Devour one another and die. But then the theme is repeated. Right? There's this just as the weak, tiny spark of life began amidst all of the powers that arrayed against it, now there's this little naked, shivering, cowering biped. Right? This little hairless biped shuffling around. Compared to the dragons, what is he? Okay? His name in this myth is Man. He's like Jack the Giant Killer. He's like David against Goliath. He's like Beowulf against the dragon. He thrives, he kills the giants. He becomes the caveman. He's muttering, growling over his enemy's bones, right? He's like Robinson Crusoe. He's dragging his screaming mate by her hair. I don't know why. But these are only the growing pains. Then he becomes true man. He masters nature, science arises, gets rid of all those superstitions, and then passing over millennia and millennia and millennia, a race of demigods now rule the planet, maybe the galaxy. They're perfected by our psychology, our psychoanalysis, our education, our economics. Man has ascended his throne. He's become God. And so now it's glory, right? But all along in the background, that old darkness, right, was looming. We've forgotten about nature in the background gnawing away, out of the reach of human power. The sun will cool. All suns will cool. The universe will run down. Life, every form, will be all of a sudden snuffed out, banished without hope of return, and it will all go back to nothing. And here's what Lewis says about this. He's like, that is one heck of a story. Like, as a story, he's like, that's kind of epic. It's got everything you want in a story. On the one hand, it means if you are feeling idealistic, well, you can regard all the nasty things in the world as the undeveloped forms of all the nice things, right? On the other hand, so vice is only undeveloped virtue, egoism is undeveloped altruism. On the other hand, if you're feeling, you can debunk all the respectable things by saying, those are just elaborations of base things. Love is just an elaboration of lust. So you can, it's very flexible. You can use the myth however you want to use it. And it gives us everything the imagination craves. Irony, heroism, vastness, tragic close. Lewis says, it appeals to every part of me except my reason. He's like, when I look at it as a story, I'm like, that is a heck of a story. He says, that myth is dead for me, but we have to be careful that we don't debunk it in the wrong way. He says, we must not fancy that we are securing the modern world from something grim and dry, something that starves the soul. Oh, no. That myth, he says, it is our painful duty to wake the world from an enchantment. There it is. That myth is a part of that enchantment. It's the deepest habit of the modern mind, and it places us under enchantment. Or rather, it's the background noise, it's the soundtrack that makes that argument of the witch plausible. And so when you then come back to that, with that in the background noise, what is the witch doing in the narrative? Well, she's asking the children to recite their catechism. There is no sun. There is no sun. There never was a sun. There never was a sun. This is familiar to all of us, right? Consider the way that our society catechizes us in the myth of evolutionism, always framing scientific and historical claims in the light of that universal narrative, vast stretches of time and distance, billions and millions, words like that, overawing our imagination, and the assumption that saying this evolved from that somehow explains something. And I don't want to underscore like the imaginative thing here. I assume that most of us in this room probably believe in a young earth creation, okay? But I want you to just think about, try this out as an experiment, okay? Actually, just for a moment, believe that. Like, try to believe that the universe, everything that is, everything that is 6,000 years old. What does it do to all of these other pieces of your imaginative furniture, the cavemen and the dinosaurs, galaxies, nebulae, all of those things that sort of float, if you go, I need to squeeze those in to 6,000 years. Like I need to go 2,000 years back to get to Jesus, 2,000 more to get to Abraham, 2,000 more to get Adam a week after his birthday. Like what does it do to your imagination? All of a sudden you're like, oh, I've got to fit in, right, the Mesoamerican civilizations and all of those Chinese dynasties somehow into that little window. Wow. It feels a little disorienting. Why? Because you've been taught well. You've been catechized. So, we have an argument, it's all projection, rooted in this reductive realism of nothing buttery, supported by mockery, patronizing mockery, and this evolutionary catechism. Okay? The last piece that I want to mention here is what Lewis says, the reason that this odd idea commends itself to us is that we've experienced it or seen it happen. Two instances that everybody acknowledges of this kind of evolutionary myth. First, he says we see individual organisms doing it. Acorns become oak trees. Grubs become insects. Eggs become birds. Every man was once an embryo. Okay? And he says the second, and he says this weighs very much in the popular imagination, is everyone has seen evolution happening in the history of machines. We all remember when locomotives were smaller and less efficient than they are now. Okay? And if you can just fast forward, like this thing right here, right? It's constantly evolving. And you can just set them up. You can just look at the original iPhone and then you can look at the modern one and you can see like, wow, the little thing, the rudimentary thing got better. Right? You can look at your airplanes. You can look at your vehicles. You can look at, right, all of these sort of things you can look at, and you can sort of see, like, yeah, they're constantly changing and improving. That, Lewis says, works on our imagination and makes that argument sound plausible. So here's the last bit that I want to bring in to the picture. In a book called The Uncontrollability of the World, a German sociologist and philosopher named Hartmut Rosa offers a theory of modernity. And I won't go into all of the details of it, but I'll give the basic thesis. He says, the driving cultural force of modern life is the idea, the hope, and the desire that we can make the world controllable. That's the fundamental modern impulse, the modern drive. But, he says, there's a paradox here. He says, because it's only in encountering the uncontrollable that we really experience the world, that the world resonates with us. Only when we encounter an uncontrollable world are we moved, touched, and feel alive. A world that is fully known, he says, in which everything has been planned and mastered and controlled, is a dead world. And he says this is the tension that we're constantly feeling. So in the modern world, he says, there's everything we encounter is a point of aggression. It has to be known, mastered, conquered, and made useful. And, you can say, well, yeah, haven't humans always been that way? It's like, yes. But our technologies, modern technologies, our economic systems make it seem possible that we could actually succeed. Man has always sought to control his environment, but all of a sudden we start to go like, I think we can. Like, I think we could just do it. Like, I think we could change, like, we could control the weather, can't we? Right? We could have the power of the gods. Like Zeus's lightning bolt, we could actually get that. And so, in such a world, everything that we encounter must be optimized. Rosa says, everyday life revolves around an ever-growing to-do list. And all the people said, amen. Modern society is stabilized through constant escalation. And there's a number of elements to this. He says, what we often see as a lust for more and more, like you think about the acquisitiveness of modern life, but everybody wants more and more and more. He says that's actually driven not by a lust for more, it's driven by a fear of having less and less. That underneath that, like, I got to keep up, is if I don't, I'm going to fall behind because everything's going to leave me behind and we're going to get stuck. Everything is accelerating. Everything is being optimized. So we live in a state of anxiety about being left behind. And so our entire existence becomes oriented to escalation. We have to develop resources, open markets, activate psychological and social potentials, enhance our capacities, deepen our knowledge base, improve possibilities of control. And so we are driven to expand and optimize. Our goal, he says, the modern categorical imperative, the fundamental law of modern life is this: always act in such a way that your share in the world is increased. Meaning, bring things into your reach and under your control. Everybody's always operating to bring things in our reach and under our control. There's 4 dimensions of control, he says. For something to be under control, it needs to be visible. You have to be able to see it. You have to be able to reach it. You have to be able to manage it. And you have to be able to make it useful. Once you've done that, that thing is now under your control. And everything in our modern life is oriented this way. And so this is actually the paradox. He says that visible, reachable, manageable, useful world, he says, is actually why it feels disenchanted. I was talking to my wife for this on the way over. It's like the difference between the first snowfall, and you guys actually know what that is now. It's great for you. When a child first experiences a snowfall, and it's like, this is amazing and magical. He says, but what changes is if all of a sudden, if you know that snowfall was produced by a machine. Does it kill the magic? Right? Or you can think about the way that all of our expectations, this is another thing we're talking about, like we're on vacation, right? We're heading on vacation. And the way that we put this certain kind of pressure on vacation, like we're going to the safari and we're going to see a lion and it's going to be magical, you hear me? Right? Okay. Right? We put these pressure because we spend all this money and it's got to be condensed and we're going there and we're going expectant, but like the more that you try to make it happen, what happens? It doesn't. It doesn't happen. And all of our modern world is like this. We're always trying to make things controllable that at their essence are not. And Rosa says that's the fundamental thing about modern life. And so you get the revenge of the uncontrollable. All of a sudden you kind of squash it and things break out. So what does this have to do with Lewis? Well, another thinker, a friend of mine named Joseph Minnick, says that the reason in the modern world, and I'm going a little over of our time, so forgive me, that this is good. We're almost done. Almost done with this first one. The second one may be shorter too. Minnick says that in the modern, he talks about the modern problem of divine absence. The modern problem. And he says, you say modern? It's like, yeah. In the ancient world, right, divine absence has always been a problem. The Psalms, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? Where are you, God? Why have you forsaken me? That's an ancient thing. What do you mean modern? The modern problem is distinguished from the ancient one, is this, the natural ease with which modern people move from divine silence and absence to divine non-existence. Like the ease with which, so ancient man, when they experienced God was silent, they would say, are you just, God? Are you wise? Do you not care? But he was there, right? Have I sinned in some way? Right? Think about the book of Job, okay? Have we alienated ourselves from God? Okay? But in the ancient world, divine absence or divine silence rarely, if ever, led to the conclusion that God did not exist at all. No one thought that. That never was the leap. In the modern world, though, divine hiddenness seems naturally lead precisely and inexorably to the conclusion he's not there. He's just not there. Even those who ultimately reject atheism, at some level, have to reckon with it as a live option because it has some plausibility for us. It has a psychological pull that must be dealt with. This is Minnick's point. And so he says, look, there's this subtraction theory, we've talked about it. God used to explain reality, but then science did, and so God is now unnecessary, we don't need him, and there's sort of like the God of the gaps. He fills in the gaps, but science is growing and growing, and he's getting smaller and smaller, and so we just kind of anticipate, hey, at some point we're going to figure out how it all works. Even if we don't know now, it's in principle knowable by humans, and if it's knowable, it will be controllable. If it's controllable, we don't need him. He's not there. But then what Minnick goes on to say is, he says, what has changed for us in the modern world is the background noise. And you go, oh, wait a minute. Lewis has something to say about this. He says that modern technoculture, and here's the connection to Rosa, fosters certain kinds of habits of mind in us. So this is the way that our technologies form and frame our lives. He says, this is a quote, modern technoculture renders unbelief a living option by posturing us toward reality in such a way that it seems devoid of immaterial dimension. How? Well, science has delivered, it's been fruitful, and it's enabled us to predict things and control things. So again, just like Rosa. But it postures us toward reality in such a way that we begin to, all of our devices, all of our technologies basically lead us to orient to reality as though it's stuff which humans can manipulate for their own purposes. It has no integrity of its own, and there are no other agencies on the other end pushing back. Everything can be sort of bent to human will. And everything in our experience, like literally this entire room is communicating that to you right now. Right? Like even just the fact, like you think, one of the easy examples is, you can make it, no matter where you live on planet Earth, you can make it to where if you're indoors, the temperature is constant year-round. What does that communicate? What is that, just that fact of life, right? And like you husbands and wives, you fight over, like, which, is it going to be 68? Is it going to be 74? Like, which one's it going to be? And it depends, right? But it's like, that's actually something we can decide. Like, it's just going to be 68 all the time now. That's just the temperature, period. And then what we do is we can do that indoors. We could probably do that outdoors. Just have to figure out the right levers to pull. But it communicates to us that the world is just stuff that we can manipulate for our own purposes. There is no other agency out there that's pushing back. And so we're catechized, background noise, right? That all of a sudden when someone comes along and says, look, I mean, God just doesn't, it's just projection. It's just a projection. We go, that kind of makes sense. Because we've been catechized. We have the soundtrack, the mood music of atheism is just constantly playing in the background. So he says the world, this is Minnick, we're almost done. He says the world that we encounter is a world for me. I don't find myself in a big, mysterious world suffused with agencies to which I am subject and I have to navigate around them. Instead, I find myself in a world almost entirely, this is a good phrase, toolified. Toolified, meaning turned into a tool. Everything has been instrumentalized. A world of my own subjective agency and an increasingly silent cosmos, and a silent cosmos has no speaker. And so Minnick goes on to note that in that disenchantment thesis, the basic idea that Max Weber, who was the guy who came up with that disenchantment narrative originally, he says the disenchanted attitude is simply this: I can know if I want. That's the attitude. If I want, I can. Like you don't. Like, there's lots of things you don't know, but you go. But if I wanted to, I could. Like I could just Google it. I don't know how. I don't know that, but somebody does. It's out there, and I can know it. It's all within my reach. And then you take it a step. I can know if I want leads naturally to I could control it if I want. And that sense of control communicates, right, that the only real things are controllable things. The only real things are controllable things. What's the real world? It's the world of human control, which means that God's not real. You can't control him. Angels, not real. You can't control them. Demons, also not real. Fairies, just pick it. Anything like that, right? It's outside of control. It doesn't exist. Everything then becomes subject to debunking. And the holdouts, right, are simply because we've not gotten all the way there yet. So we've been shaped to perceive reality this way by the technological order that we imbibe every day. And it makes us believe, right, that the things that are manipulable, observable, and visible are the only real things. The last thing I'll say is just notice in the story the psychological relief that the children experience when they finally give in. Right? It feels to them like they're actually coming home to the way the world really is. It makes great sense when they finally repeat the catechism or they finally say, "You're right." Notice even that there's a kind of necessity to it, right? When Jill finally says, "It must be so." Right? Heavy, hopeless tone, but a kind of like resignation to, I guess that's the way it is. It must be so. There's a necessity. Everything has been building, and all of the water is running downhill. Now, that's the experience in the story. I would just add, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A, that there's another kind of response that Christians in particular typically feel on the way, and it's the struggle, the doubts, and the anxieties, and the intense horror of a cosmos like that. That's another response. It doesn't just feel like relief. It feels like a fight before that. Before the relief comes a fight. And then the other emotion that often we could draw into this is the emotion of courage. This is kind of an ironic one because it's basically the attitude that says, once you kind of go, "It must be so," then you go, "Well, that seems pretty depressing. The world, it's a terrible place. It's just this dead, lifeless world. But I have the courage to face reality." And there's a kind of like, I'm man enough. I can take it. Atheism, like I can bear that burden. Everybody else needs their fairy tales, but I'm strong enough and powerful enough and have the psychological fortitude to stand against an indifferent cosmos and say, "Yeah, I know that that's what you are and I don't care." Those three emotions, the relief, the horror, and the courage, are three responses that people experience in light of this. So we'll take a break, and what time? 10:30. We'll come back at 10:30, and we'll pick up there with how does Puddleglum respond to that reality.